Well, thank you so much, Steve, and Linda also for getting me here. It was actually December 2016, and I remember very well because it was a lovely event in a fantastic setting in the Titanic Museum. We had a very good time, but it was also a start of quite a difficult period. Difficult period not only for the UK and Northern Ireland, but for many European economies. For you, of course, Brexit had quite a lot to do with it, but then it was followed by COVID. It was followed more recently by the increase in inflation and the energy prices that all you and your companies have to deal with. This is an environment that made it not easier for companies. It didn't make it easier for clusters either. But what I want to argue is that it made it even more important for you to work in cluster structures. Because, and we heard some examples of that in that little video that we just watched, because the changes that we're facing are so fundamental that it is impossible for an individual company or an individual research institution to succeed and prepare itself for that new future if it is not collaborating with others. We are in a time of a lot of change and uncertainty, but it will be impossible to succeed in that period if we are not creating new types of linkages and collaborations. For you to succeed individually as companies, but also for Northern Ireland to figure out what is your value proposition. That was one of the key questions that we discussed at that time in 2016. After Brexit, what is the key reason for why companies would want to come here? What are the key assets and capabilities that Northern Ireland offers in the context of the UK, in the context of Europe, and in the context of the global economy? So what I want to do this morning is sort of trying to give you, hopefully, sort of a shared language to start collaborating in these cluster structures. Talk a little bit about what we mean by clusters, what the research has found, why it is actually important, both for societies and communities, but also for individual companies. I want to talk a little bit about what we've learned from cluster-based economic development experience. And I can tell you we've seen quite a lot of successes, and we have some of the leading regions here, Austria, we have the Basque Country, we have Norway, we have other colleagues with us today. But we also had to learn from a lot of failures. Just by calling something a cluster or cluster effort is not a guarantee for success. It's a starting point, it opens the door. But it then depends on what you decide to do together. And I want to try to give you a little bit of a toolkit to think about what you can do in that common structure. So what is at the heart of the cluster idea? Again, it's not always people understand that the research, the modern research on clusters that Michael Porter started now a couple of decades ago, was not driven by a sort of economic motivation to try to understand why some locations were doing better than others. It was actually driven by the attempt to understand why it was that successful companies in many industries happened to not be distributed across space sort of randomly, but actually concentrated in specific places. This is not as obvious as it might look to you as you look at the reality of your economies. Because economists would usually argue that as we are competing with each other, we want to be far away from each other. We don't want to be close to these other rivals. But in fact, that's what we observed. Now, when then Porter started his research and many others in the field over the years, what is it that we found that really sort of drives these type of locations that enable high performance in individual companies and strong clusters to emerge? One aspect is what's called here related variety. And I think this is very important to understand. Some people think that clusters is just about sort of economies of scale. You're getting good at something because you're doing a lot of it. So there was this one town in China, I think, that at one point produced 80% of all buttons of the world. They were pretty good at doing buttons. But this is actually not what clusters are about. Clusters are about these networks of related and supporting industries, these ecosystems of specialists that contribute to your company's value chain and allow you to focus on what you are distinctively good at doing. So it's much more like a puzzle. Good clusters are characterized by being similar enough to each other to be relevant, but also different enough to each other to actually be complementary. I think this idea is still very relevant, and as we see a little bit later, it also means that what constitutes your cluster is changing all the time. Because as technology changes, what is relevant to you and your success will change. It's one of the dangers for policymakers that we are sometimes too static. We sort of define the box and say, this is cluster ABC, and you are not. Well, companies actually have realized that, no, this other supplier now all of a sudden, or this material provider, becomes very important because there's technology change. Proximity. Sounds like a very outdated idea. Many of you will have business partners, you will source technology, you will maybe hire people from locations far away. So why is it that proximity, location, place, being close to each other still matters? I think the way that Mike Porter put it was that we have to stop thinking about local and global as alternatives and think more about it as complements. Being in a strong cluster doesn't mean that you stop connecting globally. Actually, the opposite. But the connections that you have globally are something that all of your rivals in other locations can match. If you have the supplier in China, for example, your competitor from France will be able to have that same connection. But if you have a partner, a research institute, or a service provider close by in your location, that type of interaction is something that other rivals in another locations can't match the same way. So in that sense, a cluster is much more strategic because it makes you unique. It makes you different in ways that companies in other locations can't match. Clusters are about linkages, so we have to think about the way that we organize and live these linkages. Policymakers, and especially in Europe, often focus quite a bit on this part, on the collaboration. And this is also how usually the government programs are designed. How do you ensure collective action? How do you make sure that people get to know each other and then work together? And that is absolutely important because it doesn't just happen automatically. Collaborating is difficult. Working with other cultures, with other organizations, with other individuals. But I think what the US experience has also taught us is that collaboration and rivalry have to be balanced. Clusters are not a consortium. Dynamic clusters are structures that are open to new ideas. They are open to that crazy entrepreneur that comes up with these different ideas on how to do things. And that is what's driving their success. So as you think about your networks, make sure that you collaborate well and really use that efficiency that you gain by knowing each other well and have structures to do that. But never forget that you always have to also be open to these new ideas, especially in a type of rapid technological change. And then finally, in the middle is critical mass. We know that these effects of clusters sort of follow what we like to call an S curve. So at the beginning, you add a little bit more and the effects are not very visible. But as you create more size, the benefits of these clusters are starting to really rocket up. We have to be realistic what a small cluster can do. It's still a good starting point. It's important to collaborate at that level. but the economy-wide effects will come from a few clusters that really reach this type of critical mass. Now, one example that I've worked quite a bit with is biopharmaceuticals in Boston. I'll actually come back to that. But I wanted to focus on two aspects of this. One is, as you see here, all these different boxes. It's not just one box, biopharmaceuticals. But in fact, it's over a dozen different industries. And if you go more down into the details, there are many more. The strength of the Cambridge, Massachusetts area in life sciences is not just because they have top hospitals and research institutions, but they're actually among the top 3 in all of these areas in the US. It is that breadth of related and supporting industries that matter. The second observation, and this is very small print or very small, it's shown here, but these arrows between the boxes. Boston and New England in particular had this traditional bias to be sort of very conservative, don't work together, stay in your organization. Certainly Harvard, why should we work with anybody else? That has changed dramatically. And I think that was actually one of the reasons that this cluster became very successful, is that these barriers and boundaries were broken down. Institutions were created both in government and in the private sectors to collaborate. But what's important to understand is that this is a mindset change. It's a change of culture. It's not so much what's written in some statute of an organization, but it is that people realized they had to change and do things differently. Now, when Mike Porter wrote his book, Competitive Advantage of Nations, there were a lot of case studies. I think what we've seen now is that we've actually got a lot of evidence to show that indeed agglomeration and clusters occurs and it matters. 50% of all employment in sectors that we know geographically concentrate are located in 10% of locations. So there is very high concentrations of activities in these sectors in a few places. Not the same places for each cluster, or for each cluster categories, but overall very clear patterns of agglomeration. These clusters, so these areas, these regions, these locations where these concentrations happen, have on average across Europe 30% higher productivity than the same firms that are located in other places that are not specialized in these type of industries. That's a huge difference. By the way, it doesn't mean that you necessarily are 30% more profitable, because in these places, wages are higher. There's more competition for input factors. So a lot of these benefits actually accrue to the wider society, not just to the companies, but it's everyone that can share of these. Even more, the top locations, so the very top 5% leading locations in these industries have 150% higher productivity, so 2.5 times the productivity level of the average. They are far and ahead. This actually shows again that there's an S-curve, so it's not just a linear accession as you become stronger as a cluster, but the top clusters benefit the most. It is a very competitive era out there. You have to think about what is the market in which we can successfully play to create and attract that type of critical mass. You can't have a presentation on clusters without talking about Silicon Valley, but I wanted to focus on one aspect that might be less on people's minds. What I find particularly impressive about Silicon Valley is that this is actually a cluster that has totally reinvented itself many times over. It started with hardware, it moved to software, it moved to internet-based business models, and arguably now sort of it's just the area where you can globally scale all kinds of technologies and business ideas. There's really not much left from this time. I mean, some of these companies are still there, but their ability has been to change. Clusters are about change. They are not about creating one stable set of collaborations. It's about embracing and managing the change that you see in your industries. Another story of change is Singapore. Why do I talk about Singapore? Because I want you to understand what you see happening in your cluster is deeply connected with how the wider economy in Northern Ireland is changing. Clusters are not islands. They connect with other related clusters in the same location. They tap into the same type of business environment qualities and weaknesses that shape what you do. The tremendous story of Singapore was one that started really with very little, just a harbor. The British fleet had its bunkering there. But then it broadened in two ways. One is it became more sophisticated in maritime logistics and added other parts of logistics to it. And then it added other types of clusters through specific investments that were made in the business environment. Understanding economic development, understanding rising levels of prosperity is understanding the changes, the systematic changes in the breadth and sophistication of your cluster portfolio. This might sound far away if you're a small business owner in a manufacturing cluster, but you are part of that change story. And that change story of the wider economy provides you with opportunities that you have to manage and think through how you can use those. So what I talked about so far is just a description about how modern economies look like. I haven't talked about policy at all. Clusters emerge because companies in certain locations are more successful, grow faster, and are able to attract resources, people, and capital that other firms in other locations can't. And so a lot of economists have argued that, that we should leave it at that. That's just the way that it happens. And what government should do is basically ensure that these processes can work. I think what we've seen is that this is not quite enough. It is useful to think more systematically about the role that government has in shaping this environment, in making investments, for example, in the business environment, in academic institutions, in certain types of infrastructure, and providing certain types of financial instruments. We've seen that the collaboration, even in the Boston example, actually didn't happen automatically. It was partly political choices, it was private leadership, but it was people making active choices to ensure that collaboration happens. So clusters provide a useful frame to think about how we use the government policy interventions that we're anyway doing, that are motivated for economists by market failures. So one way to think about this, and economists love these sort of charts, so bear with me for a second. So here on the horizontal axis is more sophisticated cluster portfolios, more clusters in more attractive, higher productive sectors. On the vertical axis, better business environments, better skilled population, better infrastructure, more efficient government, better science and technology. So we know that economic development is basically going from the bottom left to the top right. But then if you're policymakers, what do? So the traditional advice from the World Bank, from the OECD, from these type of institutions is to say, invest in the broader infrastructure. Your education system, in the financial system, in science and technology. Don't focus on specific sectors, don't pick winners. If you do this, over time you will automatically sort of move towards more sophisticated clusters and industries. And by and large, I think the research shows that this is true. It's a very long process that takes many false turns and can stop for a long time. Politicians don't like to wait. So politicians often have used this other track and said, well, why can't we move here on this horizontal axis, use institutions like Invest Northern Ireland, bring in more sophisticated companies in more sophisticated sectors, and then through learning effects, get a better business environment, and ultimately sort of we upgrade. The cluster approach is sort of trying to be the best of both worlds. It recognizes that ultimately sustainable improvements in performance require a better business environment. It's actually not just a better company coming. If you don't have the skilled people to work there, you're not going to be successful in the long term. But the cluster approach tries to organize these efforts around the needs of a specific sector and industry, and it tries to tie in investment attraction and bringing in accelerators to make sure that this process works faster than in other places. Let me actually jump over that, but there's quite a lot of empirical evidence that now supports the view that you need to work on both ends. You need to work on the business environment, you need to also bring in companies. Now, what does it mean for the tools of economic development? So there's a sort of a toolkit of things that has been done that's often more firm and sector specific, from economic gardening, basically sending consultants into small companies and helping them to improve their marketing and financing and technology, to on the top, the sort of the big game hunting. Let's get the big investment in, sort of from existing to new. We also have a toolkit that's more business environment focused. Again, from broad-based things that sort of create the foundations, but then also building an airport. Maybe in the US, building a stadium. Do these big things that happen. Again, clusters and entrepreneurial ecosystems, I would say, go in the same direction, are a little bit in the middle of these sort of two trajectories. They try to upgrade the business environment, so the context that you're facing, the assets and capabilities that you can draw on as entrepreneurs, in the context of a specific sector and industry. Now, what's the track record of these different instruments? So if you look at the firm and sector specific interventions, the big challenge is that there's a very high risk. You focus your resources on an individual company, you might not make the long-term investments necessary to improve the business environment more, to actually help them to be sustainably successful. The company might run into trouble. That happens in markets all the time. They might leave as soon as the financial support that you're giving is taken away. So a lot of it is about the risks of not actually creating the foundations that these companies need to be successful. The big risk on the other side is that while we know that these improvements in the business environment are all important and necessary, they're sort of too slow moving. They work on the margin, but they never lead up to that critical mass that really drives performance enough. This is what a cluster-based approach tries to address. But how to get it right? As I said, there is a lot of examples of success, but also quite a lot of examples of failure. So let me talk about some of the things that we've learned that are important to get it right. The first observation is that it's actually a lot about collaboration within government. Now that might be surprising to many of you, especially from the private sector, who say, oh, isn't cluster all about public-private collaboration? Yes, it is. But let me tell you, from my work with many governments around the world, a key challenge is that government is entirely incredibly fragmented. It is usually organized by functional specialities that are in charge of different parts of your business environment. And if you're lucky, you have organizations that actually try very hard to support, in their area of responsibility, upgrading that business environment. But it doesn't get integrated. And so there are people that are then investing, for example, in skills and say, we need to have a better educated workforce. But it's not coordinated with investment attraction, or with investments in science and technology, or with investments in actually getting the infrastructure in place so that these more sophisticated products could actually be sold profitably on foreign markets. For many countries, the advantage of a cluster approach is to bring together these different efforts of government under a coherent understanding of how they interplay and work together. Then clusters are, of course, and I think this is what this program here in Northern Ireland supports, are about the collaboration across companies and between companies and academic institutions and government. Now, a number of years ago, when this phenomena of cluster initiatives started to emerge, we were basically asked as researchers to say, isn't there sort of a silver bullet, this magic activity that people that don't do clusters don't do, that you should do to be successful? So we tried to look at this empirically, and essentially what we found is there is no silver bullet. What is critical is that you actually figure out for your group of companies, your cluster, your network, what is the market context and what are the specific needs that you have? So don't chase after this sort of magic, modern, innovative program and activity that nobody has ever done. Think much more systematically about what's the market environment, how is it changing, what are the competitive advantages that we need to build for our companies to be successful, and then execute on them. Let me give you one example, and again, it's the context of life sciences in Massachusetts, and if you ask people about what drives the success of this cluster, they will naturally say, well, you have Harvard and MIT, and you have these top university hospitals, so what can go wrong? And to some degree, that's entirely correct. When I moved, though, to Boston in 2000, the research was world-class, but we counted the number of top 20 global pharmaceutical companies that were in Boston at the time, and we found one. Only Pfizer was there. And the reason that Pfizer was there was that the top scientists that they wanted to hire didn't want to move to Switzerland. And so they said, okay, fine, then we'll build you the research facilities in Boston. But there was not the major economic benefit to the region that the governor and also the university presidents, Larry Summers at the time at Harvard, thought would be possible. So we brought together actually the universities, the business community, and the state government to say, what is needed? And the analysis at the time showed that this was a time in life sciences and biopharmaceuticals where the innovation model dramatically shifted. So historically, innovation had happened in big R&D headquarters of these big pharmaceutical companies. That changed. Innovation moved to the university sectors and then to startups and small companies that moved out of the universities. And they became sort of the hunting grounds for the large biopharmaceutical companies to buy up new ideas and fill their pipeline. It turned out that we had top researchers, really good young PhDs, but Cambridge didn't have a good environment for these young startups. There was a lack of affordable lab space. The tech transfer rules and regulations of the universities were very unclear. There was no network of sort of management support for young entrepreneurs. There was no venture capital and legal companies that were focused on this sector. There were a lot in IT, but not in life sciences. And so what was done was to set up an institution, the Massachusetts Life Sciences Center, that basically, as a public-private institution, drove a development plan over more than a decade to change the business environment based on these observations. The economic success has been tremendous. So now there are 19 out of the top 20 global pharmaceutical companies have meaningful presence in Boston. A lot of startups, a lot of IPOs, a lot of more economic value for the state. The lesson is not that top universities are unimportant. Of course they are. But the lesson is that you need a strategy that's based on a diagnostics of your market and your industry to do what's right. And then it's about creating an institutional structure for collaboration that can also be there for some time. It's not just a project for 1 or 2 years. It does time to move forward. Let me jump over this example from Spain. You will hear more from Spain later on, but I think an interesting case is Catalonia, because here the government really looked at a whole portfolio of these individual initiatives and decided that their way to interact with the business community was through cluster organizations. They were lucky that they had at the time, when they started this, they had a Minister of Economy who himself came out of a family-owned business. He was also an academic. And his observation that was, I talk to the leaders of the big companies all the time, but the majority of my economy is actually small and medium-sized companies. Who talks to them? How do we sort of create a channel of interaction with them? And this is what they used the cluster organizations for. The Catalans have been quite good, I would say, to develop a structure in government that can strategically manage it, and also to change that portfolio over time. So as you see that some industries just lose traction, things change, they focus on something else. There was never this sort of focus on, what are the 5 clusters that are going to define our economy. No, it was a way of interacting between the public and the private sector. Again, there's quite a lot of data now that shows that this makes a difference. So locations that have successful cluster structures can actually do significantly better by improving the business environment, but also improving collaboration. Cluster efforts are very heterogeneous. One way to understand the differences that exist across these organizations is to sort of look at these 2 opposite examples in the entire spectrum of cluster organizations, what role they might play. So one is what I call here the narrow model, where you give a little bit of money, you bring a network of companies together, you try to establish linkages, and you hope for good things to happen. That often does happen. But one has to understand that there is a relationship between inputs and outputs. It changes behavior to some degree in the companies that are connected. But it's very hard with this model to change the big picture. The alternative is sort of a systemic model, which doesn't mean that you have a cluster organizations that had a huge budget, but it means a cluster organizations that has a lot of influence, in the sense of affecting what Invest Northern Ireland would do, or what your colleagues working on skills or infrastructure or research would do. That they really become the connectors and are seen as those that have an important role in guiding many of the investments that are made by government, maybe also by university organizations. It's not that one model is good and the other is bad, to be very clear about that. But you need to have clarity what the character of your network or your cluster organization is, to set the right type of goals and the right type of expectations. One of the topics that a lot of people are very focused on is which clusters to pick. And I would say, it's since there was just the Nobel Prize on Institutions, The Narrow Path to Prosperity was one of their books. There is actually this narrow path to cluster success as well. So my colleagues in the academic community have always been very focused on this and concerned about this, the California dreaming. Everybody wants to create another Silicon Valley, and yes, a lot of money was wasted. But especially in the European Union, I think we often made the opposite mistake. We were very conservative. We basically said clusters is about strengthening your strength. And that's a good starting point. But I think here and we know in many other regions that we need structural change. We can't just stick with what we have. So we have to have the right mix, and this is sort of what there is. But ultimately, this is a tactical decision that you have to make. You have to be open enough to see that there's change over time. Again, Singapore, I think, was very smart in seeing the role of individual cluster efforts as a way to enhance the overall competitiveness of their location. So their effort on life sciences, for example, which was also a very long-term structure, was really meant to drive the overall country and its economy more towards knowledge, towards entrepreneurship, to attracting people because of these assets and not anymore just efficiency and the capital stock. One issue that we heard also from Kieran about is the regional balance. And this is hard because clusters seem like they naturally sort of focus on a few places, and that's true. But that's even worse if you just only think about urban centers and think, this is where all the activity happens. Clusters, especially manufacturing clusters, can very well happen in semi-urban and more rural areas. But how do you manage this? Denmark is an interesting case study because they started out with basically saying clusters, as they are described in the literature, are sort of regional phenomena. So we'll try to find the place in the country that's most concentrated in wind energy or food or something else, and that becomes the cluster. The trouble is that in Denmark, as in the UK and Northern Ireland, even that strong point maybe accounts for 30–40% of all the activity in the country in that sector. So if you're only doing this limited local initiatives, it will never get enough leverage and size. So then they switched. They said, we do all national cluster organizations. That was much more connected to the government ministries. But the problem is it sort of fell flat on the local dynamism. And so the local clusters then started to organize their own things. What they now ended up doing is sort of a hybrid model where there is one location in the country that sort of takes the lead because that's where they're really specialized on. But their responsibility is really to engage the entire partners across the country. This might sound like minutia on how you organize your cluster policy, but it's actually quite important for how you mobilize, also in a region of limited overall size, all the resources and partners that exist. A short look to the south. So your partners in the Republic of Ireland have just announced a national cluster policy, and this is really a very interesting case. Because if you look at the outside, and I had the opportunity to work with the colleagues there in the government in the development of the policy, for outsiders, Ireland is the prime example of a cluster-driven successful economy. IT, life sciences, there are these sectors where they have been super successful in attracting investment and really creating something. So why a cluster policy? Well, while they have very strong clusters, cluster organizations are actually very weak, and there's quite a lot of data that shows that they have low membership, quite weak secretariats, and so on. Now, does that matter? Well, it doesn't matter so much on overall GDP. Republic has been doing very well on that. But it does matter in terms of the duality of the economy, so very strong multinationals, not so strong local companies. And it does matter for the regional balance of the economy, because you get these hotspots of where FDI is happening, but it's not really kind of integrating the other parts. So in the Republic, I think the key focus here is actually not just traditionally just create jobs and create more GDP, but it's how do you broaden the economic impact of the assets and the companies that are already in the country. Final comment on cluster organizations and the type of networks. Think about what type of animal in the zoo of organizations you are. Are you a service provider, basically providing strategy advice or technology services or export support to a group of companies rather than an individual company? Are you a connector? Focus on getting people together, talk about shared challenges or opportunities, ensure that collaboration is happening. Or are you an orchestrator? Actually an organization that has the ambition to not just provide an input, but help your companies sort of to get a sense of what's the overall strategy of our location. What do we as a cluster stand for? The demands, so your internal capabilities in each of these fields are quite different. And again, it's not that one is better than the other, but it's important to have clarity on what is the role and ambition that you have with your cluster organization. Couple of minutes just to end on what has changed. So we've learned a lot about the cluster experience and the experience with cluster-based economic development over the last decades. But I think we're now again sort of, I would say, at a cusp of something very new. And this is not because our research has come up with any new great insights on clusters, but it is because our economic environment has changed so dramatically. And we need to think about what's the role of our clusters in that context. Now, there's a lot of things going on in the affecting economic geography. Some of them are driving towards more agglomeration, so essentially making clusters stronger. And I would say the key force is that companies everywhere are competing more in innovation and knowledge. And innovation and knowledge is really concentrated a lot in specific locations. It's also because the well-trained people tend to co-locate much more and are present in a fewer number of places. But at the same time, we also had, especially during the last phase of globalization, forces of dispersion. Transportation costs, communication costs have moved down. You can manage global organizations, which means that you can have your supplier somewhere else if that's more efficient. So the result has been not that clusters have disappeared or become smaller, but they have become more focused, so kind of more narrowly concentrated of being one part of a global value chain, and more interconnected. You're not just competing with other clusters, but you have partnerships with other clusters. We're now faced not just with sort of the evolution that we've seen over the last couple of decades in terms of agglomeration and forces, but now we have this, what the German Chancellor described as Zeitenwende. He wasn't quite as good as acting on it, but at least he found a term to describe it. But that there are sort of fundamental changes that require more than just a marginal response, a little bit better technology, running a little bit faster, but actually changing to the changes in geopolitics and technology, climate change, societies require us to sort of really create new types of structures. Entire markets and value chains are restructured. That means that these definitions of what is your puzzle of related and supporting industries is changing. You have to look in totally new corners to figure out what's the right material, what's the right input, what's the right customer for my product or service. I'm German. You've read the news about the German car industry, which was tremendously successful in that old model, but is struggling with sort of moving more to an era of digitalization, where the product itself is changing. We've seen that in telecommunications in Europe. We had Nokia, and yes, they might have made some management mistakes, but the basic shift was that the entire industry and its technology changed. And their inherent capabilities and strength just weren't as relevant anymore. The danger now in Europe and for the German car industry is that the same might happen there. So you have to think about your industry and say, okay, I can't change these big forces, but what's my place? Where can I use my capabilities and skills? Maybe it's an entirely different context. And this is where we've seen that if you have that conversation alone, it's very hard to succeed. If you have that conversation and take those actions jointly in a network, at least your odds of success are much higher. Green transition. We talk a lot about at the macro level, do we need degrowth? Can we achieve decoupling? Might there even be an opportunity for green growth? But for individual companies, I think what it means is that the market and the way that competition works is entirely transformed. Your value chains are transformed, and entirely new industries are emerging. That is really hard to get your heads around, especially if you're a small company. This is where collaboration with others, with other companies, small and large, with academic institutions, with research partners, can really be helpful. That's not important always, but it is important in a period where there is this dramatic structural change. We also see a huge change in what our societies expect from us. And there you can say as an entrepreneur, well, my job is to be profitable, and yes, I want to be a good citizen to my community. But actually, if you're in a cluster structure, you are inevitably part of sort of the political arena, because the policymakers have to justify their decisions towards the entire society and say, how is what we're doing here not only helping this company maybe create a few jobs, but actually helping us more broadly with the green transition, with creating better jobs and so on. If you're a company in such a structure, you need to be aware of that. Doesn't mean you have to become a politician, but you have to understand that the dynamics of these collaborations are significantly affected by what is the perceived value not only for you, but for the community and the society here in Northern Ireland of that type of structure. I work a lot on overall competitiveness of locations, and I think the old model that, again, Mike Porter was so instrumental in developing was relatively easy. It was all about what we call then competitiveness in the sense of being able to support high levels of productivity and innovation. And there was this whole toolkit to analyze that and so on. What we're seeing now is actually a radical shift to a different type of environment. It's not just about creating value through being productive and innovative, but it is about governments intervening to capture value, to change the rules of the game, to use their size, their financial capabilities, their technological prowess, the attractiveness of their markets, to capture markets not just because they are the best, but because they have the power to influence those things. That is a challenge for Northern Ireland as a small region. It's quite honestly, and I'm not talking about the politics, but it's a difficult situation for the UK. It's difficult enough for Europe. If you work in other parts of the world, we increasingly are seen as less relevant because these things matter more, and we're not quite as good and as adept and willing to use these resources. It's also, by the way, then much more important that you have efficient government. If government policy is just about creating open markets, it's relatively easy, you just need to be small. If success is about having powerful government, you also have to have competent government, not just large government. And that's still a test that has to be out there. Let me finish with this slide, and I think I want to show this slide because I would like to leave you with the thought that the success that you have in your cluster networks is, of course, primarily for your companies to do better. But you should think about the success of those cluster networks as contributing to an overall strategic positioning of Northern Ireland. What do we stand for? What's the value that we provide as a business location? And what are therefore those type of activities that actually find a good home here, where companies can be successful both locally but also within the UK and beyond? Brexit, I think, has opened that question much harder for the UK on what do we stand for, and also for Northern Ireland. But beyond all the discussions about the trade regime with the Republic and the rest of the EU, I think the fundamental question that ultimately has to be answered is, what is it that attracts companies because of the unique capabilities and assets and opportunities that Northern Ireland, with that specific combination of your location and who you are, offers, that others want to drive on? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. We have got some short period of time, maybe 5 minutes. If there are some questions that anybody on the floor would like to ask Christian, we have some roving mics around. Anyone like to ask a question? We're very shy in Northern Ireland. Here we go.
I take this as you're thinking about what I said, which is very good. Sir.
Hi, Christian. I really enjoyed your presentation. My name is Michael Bell. I work in food and drink, and I've been doing clustering for 3 decades anyway. Back to your DNA slide,
Yep.
the one with the triangle in the middle of it. I noticed that you didn't have the environment anywhere on those forces. And in my experience, no matter what government or industry do, if the environment is broadly neutral, clustering just doesn't happen. If the environment is, there's a big gain for us clustering, or there's a big threat that we can address through clustering, then I think you can move, and you can move very quickly. But in my experience, if the environment is really very neutral, is what I've found, that people say, well, why would we do anything? What's your thoughts?
No, I very much agree with you. You know, there was this other slide that talks about, you know, what is the success driver of cluster initiatives. And I think maybe the most important one is indeed the environment, including sort of the trust and the collaboration between different types of institutions. I think that is absolutely critical. You know, otherwise you can have some impact within your small group, but you're not reaching out. You also made another point which I think is very important. What drives collaboration and change? And unfortunately, I think, at least so far from what I've seen in my work, is that it almost always does require crises. Because collaboration is hard. I mean, we like to talk about it as sort of something that's very nice and positive. Yes, it is. But it requires extra effort. We speak different languages. We come from different backgrounds. So there needs to be a clear prize to win from collaboration, and that's most obvious if there is a crisis. And you know, I think the magic of good policy making is to make sure that we don't hitting the wall, but you know, at least seeing the wall, start to collaborating and doing things differently.
Very good. Any other questions? There we go. Just down here, Brian. Oh, okay.
Clusters, narrow, and all the.
Yeah.
There we go.
Now it's
Okay,
on.
so now, but how do you re-engage a clusters program when you've got kind of legacy clusters? You want to bring in the kind of new dynamic, and you have organisations that have, you know, 5 or 6, 7 different roles that are all identified as kind of cluster leadership organisations. It's how do you corral all of that to then give you what you need to put in place to be successful?
Yeah, you know, you really need to think about this as a task and change management, right? I mean, I think it has a lot to do with culture. It has a lot to do with leadership. How these play out, I have to be honest, I don't think there is a sort of one roadmap that applies everywhere, because this is so much driven by your history, your institutions, your people. I do believe that this requires some sort of top-down action. Otherwise, you don't get the systemic shift that is required. So I think the signal that comes, and this is where government plays an important role. It could also come from some large companies or a big university, but usually it does require a government leader to say, you know, here's the direction. But then also being willing to say, and I respect that the operational choices are not something that I can do or government can do, but this is something where the private sector or other leaders have to take over. But that's, you know, this, you have to really look at the specifics of your situation, especially, as you said, I mean, Scotland has a lot of experience with these type of cluster efforts. Sometimes that can be good. It can also be a hindrance, because it sort of has already shaped how people see what this means and how you can use it.
Thank you. Christian, thank you very much for that global perspective. Really appreciate it.